Hello, fellow travelers. Welcome back to the Polity Presents podcast, which is a podcast that focuses on my tour of my home country as a local, and it also particularly focuses on cultural heritage tourism in South Africa. In today's episode, we are going to, and by going to, I mean we are focusing. We are focusing on the Slave Lodge in Cape Town. The Slave Lodge is a museum in Cape Town that really delves into the history of slavery that occurred in South Africa. Y'all, this I first learned of this place as a student in Cape Town. I was a University of Cape Town student and I was doing my master's there. And one of my favorite things to do during this time there was to visit do a museum tour on Fridays. And why I did this on Fridays was because museums were free to students. You just present your student card and you get in for free and you get to learn this history. You have this access to this history. Other than that, it's still affordable. Pensioners get a reduced price, and I think adults, they pay a maximum of like 30 rand. If I'm correct, well, things change, time changes, things go up, and the price might have slightly gone up from that. But if I remember well, from my time in Cape Town, I think the price for adults and normal, ordinary citizens that aren't students or pensioners, they would pay 30 rand to have access. So it's still affordable. It's not expensive. They're not trying to rip you off. I think this is just a fee to help maintain this history and have it be there for future generations. So yeah, guys, when I first learned of the Slave Lodge, I was taken aback. Wow. To this day, I still am. I catch myself thinking, damn, what? This happened? Because usually when we think of slavery, we think of it as a transatlantic thing, right? We think of it as something that happened up north in West Africa and Central Africa, and it was something that was perpetrated by the Americans and the British, where they took people from their homeland in Africa and stole them as property to have in western parts of the world, which would be Britain and America. It never occurred to me that this is a history that is also part of South Africa. And this was not taught in our history book while I went to school in the northern part of South Africa, which would be Gauteng, Limpopo, the Northwest. That is where my schooling occurred as a young girl, because I studied in different parts of the country, and these are these regions there. And somebody in Cape Town might beg to differ, right? A student who grew up in Cape Town might have, might argue this and say that they learned this information in high school. Well, that's not my case. I learned this detail when I went to Cape Town, and this is why it was so mind-blowing for me, because I still remember how I would watch this is so sad. what I'm about to reveal about myself. But I still remember watching like documentaries about slavery, and I think it's sad for those people. But thank God it did not happen to us. Right? It is so wrong. Until I learned that it actually did happen to us. I laugh at myself because I was such a fool. I was so um I was sympathetic, but I was also desensitized from that detail of world history, global history, until I learned that, hey, it is a part of your heritage as a South African as well. And I was touched. That's when I started getting touched about slavery. Okay, let me try to get myself back together and get my train of thought back together. Oh, I'm so pathetic. Yeah, so I first learned about this detail of our history at the Slave Lodge. And I think a big part of this is that when you are entering the Slave Lodge, you are entering the actual building where slaves were kept. And so when you know this, it adds another depth to this place. Like, people were held against their own will in this location, and they were held in very unsanitary conditions and treated in very inhumane ways. Like, I am standing in this part. I am literally standing in this history, right? So that's another element of it that really brings this weight of this history. So, who are the perpetrators of this slavery in South Africa? How did it come to be that slavery became a part of South Africa? Well, this started when the Dutch people found a different route to get to Asia. So this is during the 17th century, I believe. Yes, the 17th century, the 1600s, the 1500s, the 1400s. This is, when the Europeans, the Portuguese in particular, were, exploring the world and trying to find a different route to Asia to, trade with civilizations in that area. And they used this route because of issues that were happening in the Mediterranean Sea, which would have been the fastest route for them to get to Asia and, get the spices, get the colorful cloths, clothing material, and artifacts, really have this cultural exchange with Asian people in Asia. However, when these complications occurred, they had to find a different route, and this route included going along the transatlantic ocean down to the Indian Ocean and up again the Indian Ocean to get to Asia. And so this was a very long route. And so one thing that the Dutch people had to do was to make a pit stop for themselves as a halfway point. It's like, when you're on a road trip and you're driving and you need to refuel yourself, you'll stop at a garage. So it was kind of like a garage type of situation. So where they can refuel, get fresh water, fresh food, take a rest on land, and then re-energize themselves for the other half of their journey up to Asia. Okay, so as this was happening, I guess people thought, okay, we can settle here, we can make a life here. People started settling here in these areas and making these places home. And as a result, slavery came into being. But if the slavery was not only for the people who were settling in Cape Town, it was also for people in the European areas, because slavery is already a thing in Europe. So not only were they buying merchandise, were they buying spices, they were also buying people, right? And bringing these people to this halfway point before journeying on with them back to Europe. And so with this, I need to mention that slavery is a thing that occurred strictly in the Cape Town, Western Cape area. One thing I've read in the historical information that's archived at the Slave Lodge is that one rule that they had was to not enslave natives. That would be the African people that they found here. Well, there is a debate around whether that is the truth or not. But what I read is that the rule was you do not enslave natives. The people that we're going to enslave are the people that we're going to buy from these other parts of the world. But history might have a different version of that. The Khoisan people especially might have a different testimony about that. Because if they were to enslave natives, most likely would have been the Khoisan people, because they were the most significant group of natives in that area. And which is why maybe this history is not taught in the northern part of South Africa, because we were not touched by it. It did not affect us. Or it did not affect us in the traditional sense of slavery. It might have, probably might have an ancestors. If we were to wake up the ancestors, there might be an ancestor being, hey, y'all, I was enslaved, and they might recount a different type of slavery. But it wasn't widespread, I can say that. If that is the case, then it was probably a unique thing. Coming back to the Slave Lodge. So, the Slave Lodge, this is where these people that were bought in places such as Indonesia, Bali, India, China, and other places that I might have missed, that I'm missing. Oh, Madagascar and Mauritius as a part of those groups of people that were enslaved. This is where they would be brought as a halfway point before being taken further to European destinations. And here they were kept in very inhumane conditions. They were kept in a dark, cold space, and if you live in Cape Town, especially during the winter season, wow, you will understand that is just not ideal. That is torture, because the weather in Cape Town is, especially during winter, is particularly cold and wet. So imagine being kept in this cold, dark place, and you have little clothing. So, people were really treated inhumanely here, and they used to sit in their feces, in their urine, because they were not cleaned. And they were really let out. Like, these people were kept as stored goods, right? And so this is what the slave lodge unpacks. It unpacks this history. It also tries to give you an idea of how the journey would have been going further, right? Like, if they were bought and transported, or meant to be transported to places such as Britain or America, what that journey would have been like. There's a replica of a ship, and it gives you an idea of how small or what were the conditions of that ship. Another feature of the slave lodge is a room that has these months there, right? And it tries to explain the legacy of slavery and how it's still present in Cape Town, particularly, or in South Africa, because, and by present I don't mean like the actual manifestations of slavery, but the descendants of slaves. They are people who have surnames such as January, October, March, right? And these people are evident of slavery, because when people were bought, their last names would be the month in which they were bought. And so it shows that, these people are descendants of slavery, and it's still prevalent in contemporary society. There are also many other parts of the museum that you can check out. I really encourage you, if I were to go into each and every room and explain everything, it would be a very long podcast. So I encourage you that when you do visit the slave lodge, really do sit with this information, really engage with it. Just don't walk in and then walk out. Like, really engage with the information that the museum provides. But my favorite part in this slave lodge is this room that tries to show all of these cultures that were affected by slavery here in the Cape. So in this room, you'll find like cultural artifacts from these nations and the things that they came with, the toys that they made, the clothes that they came with, the jewelry that they had on them. It really tries to paint a picture of the fact that, these were real people, and with their own that had their own cultural identities, and they were so unique, so complex, and slavery stripped that away from them. So really engage with that when you do visit the slave lodge. Another thing that I want you to take note of when it comes to the slave lodge, and that I think a lot of people miss, is called the slave auction tree. So at the back of the slave lodge is a landmark, right, that marks the tree where slaves were sold and bought, right? And it's so easy to miss this because there is no border or board. Sorry, I meant board. There is no board that signals that, hey, this is where the slave auction tree was. So one has to be very, very, very slow and patient in the search of this thing. I really had to really be careful to not miss this landmark. So I hope I'm gonna try to direct you if you're very interested in this tree. So you walk onto the street, and it's in the middle of the road. It's in the pavement that is in the middle of the road. There are trees there, and then there's a break in these trees, and that is where the slave auction tree is memorialized. Sorry, guys, English. So do also check it out, stand there, because when you stand there, you are standing at a place where families were ripped apart, where people's dignity was taken from them. It is a really surreal thing, a surreal place to be standing at, because you realize so many lives, so many families was disrupted by this thing. People's agency, their freedom was taken here, right? People were reduced to property at this tree. They had a value placed on them, and if a person could afford that value, they took them home and treated them however they wanted to. So, yeah, if you're in Cape Town, please do check out the Slave Lodge and engage with that history, especially as a South African, because they are parts of our history that have not been documented, or that have been documented in very selective ways. Right? Like I said, growing up, I did history in school, and I never learned of this. Whereas a child from Cape Town would say, what do you mean? This is obvious history, right? So please do engage with that. Learn about how complex our history is, because one thing that our tourism information does, it paints this picture of, black oppression and then resistance, right? The dominant history that's being told about our country is apartheid, racial segregation, and people of color's resistance of this thing, and therefore overcoming this thing. But our history is so much more complex than that. There are details of our history that fall outside of that, and the Slave Lodge really does put that into perspective. So if you find yourself in Cape Town, do that. It's affordable, and it's very informative. It's worth your money, and you'll walk away a much more knowledgeable human being. So that's it for today's episode. Thank you for listening. I hope that this helps you in your travel planning and helps you make wonderful memories, and helps you to be more informed as a tourist. Enjoy!